everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Ashley and I like to talk about books, and today I'm going to be talking about my favorite audiobooks and some listening tips to help you get into audiobooks if you're trying to. Always been an audiobook listener. I really didn't fully get into audiobooks until the last 1 to 2 years, and before that I was avidly against audiobooks. I was not able to listen to them and understand the story I was reading. I didn't understand the appeal of them. I just didn't really think they were for me. But after getting some helpful tips and finding the right audiobooks for me, I have come to love audiobooks, and they make up at least 40 to 50% of my reading. And it's really what helps me read so many books each year. So I really highly encourage people to give audiobooks a try, and I love to share my tips for how to really effectively listen to audiobooks. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to start first with my audiobook recommendations for some of my favorite audiobooks, and then in the second part of the video we're going to move on to some quick listening tips that will help you get into audiobooks, how to understand audiobooks better, and how to find the ones that will work for you. So first, let's talk about my favorite audiobooks that I've ever listened to. First up is Untamed by Glennon Doyle. I personally really love listening to nonfiction in audiobooks. I think it is so cool when you get to hear someone tell their actual story through an audiobook, especially when it's a memoir. It just works really well for me. And Glennon Doyle reads her own memoir in the audiobook version of Untamed, so I just really enjoyed that aspect of it. It's kind of like listening to a podcast or like a TED Talk or something where someone is just talking to you and telling you about their life experiences. So I think memoirs are a really good place to try starting if you're having trouble getting into audiobooks. But I found Untamed to just be a really good audiobook listen. I think the way Glennon Doyle reads the book is really well done. She really places really nice emphasis on what she is saying, and you can tell she really means the message that she is trying to communicate. So this story is about Glennon Doyle's life and how she ended up falling in love with a woman while she was married to a man, and then ended up leaving her marriage and is now with that woman who is Abby Wambach, if you happen to know Glennon Doyle's story and know who they are. But she talks a lot about just what it is like to be a woman, how women and girls are raised, and how to break out of these barriers and these conceptions of how you're supposed to live as a woman and become untamed and free yourself from those cages. She also talks a lot about the way she's raising her children, and I just really love that story. As a woman, I found it to be a very powerful story. I know a lot of other women and a lot of my other friends also really love this book as well. So if you haven't heard of this yet and haven't given it a try, highly recommend this one. Next up is a bit of a sadder book, and that is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. This is a story about a group of 4 guy friends who live in New York City, and it follows them throughout their life and just the trials and tribulations they face. It talks about what it is to be a friend, what it is to be loved, human connection, human struggles, lots about mental health, tons of trigger warnings in here. Very hard book to read. Pretty much any trigger warning you could think of is packed into this book. It is a lot to handle. But the reason that I enjoyed this book, I really liked the narration style of it. I thought it matched the tone of the writing really well. Sometimes those things don't match up with the narrator and the tone that they're giving to the intensity of the story, but I thought this narrator did a really nice job telling the story. And I also just think this was a really nice audiobook to listen to because this is such a long book. It is an 800-page long book that can be very challenging to pick up because it is so heavy and upsetting. So I really liked having the audiobook to listen to while I was also reading the physical copy and kind of going back and forth. Next up, I have a horror audiobook recommendation, and that is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Iain Reid. This is a story about a couple who are on the way to visit the guy's parents for the first time. He is introducing his girlfriend to his parents, and it follows them on the car ride there and then at the parents' house, and then what happens after. It is a very slow burn, claustrophobic story that builds up a lot of tension and suspense and is really great to listen to on audiobook. If you've read this story before, you will definitely know what I'm talking about, but there's a particular thing that happens in the ending of the book that is just really interesting and powerful to listen to specifically on audiobook versus reading the physical copy, and it just really brings the story to life in a really cool way. So if you can listen to the audiobook version of this, I highly recommend that. I think it is such an interesting way to consume this story. I have personally done both. I read the physical copy and then I listened to it on audiobook afterwards because once I knew what happened, I wanted to experience the story in an audiobook format as well, and it is just really cool. A very interesting interesting and unique listening experience for sure. Next up, I have one of my favorite books of all time, and that is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is a fantasy story about this traveling circus that comes out at night and you never know where it's going to be, and there are these two magicians that are at the circus who have been pitted against each other in a competition, and it's kind of tricky to explain because it's not the most straightforward story, but it is just very magical. There is romance, it is so atmospheric, and listening to the audiobook just really brings it all to life in a really nice way. I really enjoyed the narrator's voice of this story. Something about it just feels like you're being read a bedtime story. It is like an older British man is what it sounds like. Oh my gosh, it's just so cozy and so comforting and such a good way to listen to this story. This is an audiobook I could go back to again and again because the story is just so beautiful. The writing is so lyrical and wonderful to listen to, and I really just love the narrator's voice. So if you're interested in The Night Circus, I would definitely recommend the audiobook, and even if you've already read The Night Circus, I would say go back and listen to the audiobook because it might make you love the book even more. Next up, I have two books that I'm going to pair together, and that is The Unhoneymooners by Christina Lauren and Shipped by Angie Hockman. These are two romance books that are very similar. They are both enemies to lovers, and they are both like tropical vacation romance stories, and I really enjoyed both of them on audiobook. I think romance is another genre that I find myself really drawn to for audiobooks because they're just so easy to listen to, and there's usually a lot of playful banter in romance stories, and so it's really nice to actually hear that from someone reading the story to you. Both of these were really quick listens for me. They were both a lot of fun. They're both some of my favorite romance stories, so if I had to pick romances to recommend to you on audiobook, these would be the two I would recommend. But really, I just think romance is a really nice genre to listen to an audiobook in general, especially when there's really good banter. And then the last audiobook I have to recommend is Black Buck. This is a satirical story about a black salesman in New York who just ends up getting pulled into the crazy world of sales, and there are even crazier things going on in the workplace that just build and build and build throughout the story. I think this is such a good audiobook, not just because I enjoyed the story or the pacing of it, but really just because this is one of the most energized audiobooks I've ever listened to from the narrator, like really bringing the story to life. There is like a lot of sales training in this book, so it's like a lot of very aggressive, like sales lingo, and the narrator does such a nice job of bringing that to life. There's a ton of energy, there's a ton of yelling. It can be a little bit overwhelming if you don't like that kind of stuff. If you like a more relaxing reading experience, this one might not be for you, but I just really thought it was one of the most unique audiobooks I've ever listened to. There's also lots of great music that is at the intros of the chapters that helps bring the story to life. So I just thought this one was a ton of fun, but like I said, it can be a little bit overwhelming, so you gotta know what's right for you. And that is it for my favorite audiobook recommendations, and now I'm going to be sharing some of my tips for how to listen to audiobooks or how to just get into audiobooks if you've never really given them the chance. So my first tip is to read the physical copy of the book at the same time that you listen to the audiobook, if that is an accessible option for you. Alternatively, if you have like an ebook that you can look at and read while you're listening to the audiobook, that would work as well. But this is what people call immersive reading, and it can really help you start to learn how to listen to audiobooks and actually retain the information that is being said. I think that's one of the biggest hurdles people face when they're listening to audiobooks. It's one of the biggest hurdles I face, is you can just zone out, start thinking about something else and not catch the story, and then it's harder to go back in an audiobook and find where the last time was that you knew what was happening and scan it like you would if you were reading a physical copy. So I think it's just a really great experience if you've got a physical book that you can just open up and read just like you're planning on reading anyway, and the audiobook version that you can listen to as you're reading. It can help you start to figure out the right pacing for you. It can help you figure out the right speed that you should listen to an audiobook at. I personally listen to audiobooks around like 1.75 speed to 2.25 speed depending on the book, but it's really nice to help you figure out your normal pace of reading and what you should listen to and what you'll be able to retain. It also just really helps bring a book to life. So I just think that's such a fun way to listen to audiobooks and to enhance your reading experience if you are just looking to really have a book be brought to life as you're reading it. The next tip I have is to find your genre. Not every genre of audiobooks is going to work for you, most likely. They definitely don't all work for me, and I've had to pick and choose and play around with what genres work best for me in the audiobook format and which I just prefer to have a physical copy to read for. So for me personally, I started listening to audiobooks only for nonfiction books, but especially for or memoirs. I just found that to be the most easy transition from like listening to podcast into listening to an audiobook, because it's very similar. They're telling their story, especially if the narrator is the person who wrote the book. I think that can be really fun. If it's someone well known, if you have a favorite comedian or actress or just important figure that you really like who has a memoir, that can be a good place to start. I'm thinking like Becoming by Michelle Obama. Like every comedian in the world has a memoir, it feels like. Like I mentioned, Untamed by Glennon and Doyle is a great one. So if you've had trouble getting into audiobooks in the past, maybe try that. Other genres that work really well for me are romance. I think there's usually more simplistic writing in a romance because the story is more focused on the dialogue between the characters, at least for most modern romances. And so there's not a lot of exposition to get lost in. There's not a lot of world building. There's usually just a few characters. It's really easy to follow along with a romance, so I find those work really well for me. But what doesn't work as well for me is things like thrillers or horror books. I tend to prefer those in the physical format. There are some that will work for me in audiobook format, and there's some authors that I know I'm going to be able to understand their books and retain it in the audiobook format, like Ruth Ware. I can usually listen to a Ruth Ware book on audiobook and know what's going on. But some other authors who do really complex stories or really deep thrillers, I usually try to stay away from those in the audiobook format. But like I said, it's going to be different what works for you and what doesn't. So try a couple different genres to see which ones you're liking and which ones you might not want to listen to. My third tip is to take notes. I always have notes open on my phone that I'm keeping track of when I'm listening to an audiobook. I'm taking notes of character names and who they are and how they're related to each other, if there's certain settings or places that are mentioned, and I'm even taking notes of just like basic plot points if it's a complex story that I feel like I'm gonna forget certain things. And especially if you're listening to an audiobook over like a 2-week time span, it's really common that you're gonna forget a couple things. And when you have a physical book, if you start at a new chapter, you might look back on the past chapter to see, oh, where did we end? Like what was recently going on? But with an audiobook, you can go back and listen to it, but it's just harder to not have that visual context of where you are in the story and to flip back and see who certain people are. So I just find it really useful to have notes to refer back to so you can keep up with the story. If there's a ton of characters in a story, I think that's a very important thing that I like to note, is just remembering who's who and what the names are. And I also, like I said, like to make note of plot points so I can help remember what's been going on in the story so far and what the major points of the story are. My fourth tip is to just find the time to prioritize giving audiobooks a shot. I think with anything in life, if you want to do it, you've just got to make the time for it, and audiobooks are the same. I find that I like to pick up audiobooks when I have little spurts of free time in the day. I don't need to like sit down and listen to an audiobook for an hour like I might do when I'm reading a physical book. I can just listen to it and pick it up whenever. So when you're in the car, when you're cooking dinner, when you're washing the dishes, when you're doing your laundry, when you're vacuuming your house, there's so many little times during the day that you can just plug in some earphones and listen to an audiobook. Even if you only have like 20 minutes, if you're listening on 2x speed, you get through 40 minutes of the book, and most audiobooks are about 8 hours long. So that's really just a couple of sessions of finding time throughout the day to listen to it, and you'll be through a book faster than you think. And my last tip for listening to audiobooks is to use Libby if you can, if that's an option for you. Libby is an app where you can connect with your local library, use your local library card number, or get a library card online to hook up to the app. That's what I did. And then you're able to access audiobooks through your library system for free. I think if you're gonna try audiobooks, if you don't know if you're gonna like them or not, Libby's the way to go, because you will spend no money, you will not have any wasted costs, and you can get all the books that you're interested in trying out for free. I love Libby. It's where I listen to most of my audiobooks. I love creating lists of the books I have on my radar. Some books you have to go on hold for if there's long wait times, depending on your library and what books they have available. But I just think it is the absolute best platform to use if you're trying to read audiobooks, but you don't want to get something that's a subscription service or pay any money when you're like, I don't even know if I'm gonna like audiobooks. Libby's the way to go. So that is it for all of my favorite audiobooks and all of my listening tips for listening to audiobooks. I hope you found this video useful and either found some audiobooks that you want to listen to or got some inspiration for how to make audiobooks work better for you. Like I said, I just love audiobooks. I'm so glad I finally got into them. I can't believe I ever lived without them, honestly. I will never look back. If you have any other audiobook recommendations or tips for listening to audiobooks, definitely leave those down below so that I can read them and so that everyone else can read them too and find new favorite audiobooks and get even better at reading them. But that is it for me. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on my next video. Bye!